The air in Redemption, Texas tasted of iron and fear. It was the summer of 1870, 2 years before the dust would settle on Caleb Thorne's soul. The sun hammered down on the clapboard buildings, bleaching the street to the color of bone. Inside the First Redemption Bank, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and sweat. Marshal Caleb Thorne stood with his back pressed against a teller's cage, the polished wood digging into his spine. A stray bullet had shattered the grand clock on the wall. Its pendulum hung limp, a silent testament to time stopping. Outside, the world had descended into chaos. Harlan Pike and his gang had ridden into town at high noon, not like thieves in the night, but like kings reclaiming a throne. They moved with a military precision that spoke of a past much darker than petty robbery. Pike, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, orchestrated the assault from the center of the street, his voice cutting through the gunfire with chilling clarity. Caleb had been caught off guard, a cup of coffee halfway to his lips in the sheriff's office, when the first shots rang out. He'd done his duty rallying the few brave townsfolk who hadn't fled, but Pike's men were different. They weren't just bandits. They were soldiers fighting a private war. They flanked, they suppressed, they moved with a discipline that had left Caleb's meager posse pinned down and bleeding. Now trapped in the bank with the last of the gang, Caleb faced the man himself. Pike was leaning against the vault door, which was blasted open and smoking. He was wiping dust from a stack of currency with a silk handkerchief, looking more like a gentleman banker than a murderous outlaw. 2 of his men held the bank manager and a young teller at gunpoint. "You're a good marshal, I'll give you that." Pike said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone that was more unnerving than any shout. "Brave. But bravery is just a fancy word for not understanding the odds." Caleb's Colt was empty. He'd fired his last round, taking down the man who tried to shoot the teller. His rifle lay just out of reach. He was cornered, defeated. The weight of his failure pressed on him heavier than the Texas heat. "It's over," Caleb said, his voice raspy. "You've got the money. Just leave these people alone." Pike chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. He tucked the money into his saddlebag and sauntered toward Caleb. He moved with a predator's grace, his eyes scanning Caleb from head to toe, lingering on the silver star pinned to his vest. "It's never just about the money, Marshal. It's about the principle. It's about taking what the world owes you." He stopped inches from Caleb, so close Caleb could see the fine lines etched around his eyes. "You wear that star like a shield. But what does it protect a town that scatters like quail at the first sign of trouble? A government that sends boys to die for a cause they barely understand." He reached out not for Caleb's gun, but for the chain around his neck tucked beneath his shirt. With a swift tug, he pulled it free. Dangling from the end was a small silver locket tarnished with age and intricately engraved with a single rose. Caleb's blood ran cold. Don't he breathe the word a raw plea? Pike's smile widened. He flicked the locket open with his thumb. Inside, nestled on one side, was a miniature hand-tinted photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Caleb's late wife, Sarah. "Pretty," Pike murmured, his voice laced with a cruel tenderness. "She looks like the kind of woman who believed in men like you. Believed in honor, in duty." He snapped the locket shut. "Keepsakes are for the victorious, Marshal. A reminder of what they fight for. You've lost." He slipped the locket into his own pocket. The violation was more profound than any bullet wound. Pike had not just stolen money. He had stolen Caleb's last connection to a life that made sense to the memory that had kept him human through the war and the lonely years after. One day Caleb said, his voice shaking with a rage so deep it was almost silent, "I will find you." Pike simply patted him on the cheek. I surely hope so. A man needs a hobby. He turned to his men. Let's ride. Leave the lawman with his shame. It's a heavier burden than a rope. And just like that, they were gone. They rode out of redemption, leaving behind a smoking bank wounded men and the shattered shell of Marshal Caleb Thorne. He didn't pick up his star from the dusty floorboards. He just knelt there, his hand covering the empty place on his chest where the locket used to rest the ghost of its cool metal, a permanent brand against his skin. The clock was broken. His time as a man of the law was over. All that was left was the hunt. 2 years later, the sun was a merciless god, and the Arizona desert was its altar. The cracked earth baked under a sky the color of faded denim, and the air shimmered in waves of heat, making the distant mesas tremble like ghosts on the horizon. Caleb Thorne, no longer a marshal, was now a ghost himself. He drifted through this scorched landscape, a man hollowed out by grief and driven by a single cold purpose. Find Harlan Pike. Find the locket. His journey had led him here to the edge of a town that was less a community and more a festering wound on the face of the territory. Dust Creek. Even its name tasted of grit and finality. Caleb's boots were caked with the dust of 1,000 miles, his coat was a threadbare patchwork of repairs, and the scar on his jaw, a relic from a forgotten skirmish in the war, ached with a phantom pain that mirrored the one in his heart. The man who entered Dust Creek was a specter, his face shadowed beneath a battered hat, his eyes holding the flat, weary gaze of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. He had spent the last coin from his pocket on a piece of stale jerky 3 days ago. Now all that remained was a single folded silver dollar tucked into a hidden seam of his boot. It was his last anchor, a keepsake he refused to spend, a symbol of a promise he couldn't break. The Dead Lantern Saloon was the town's beating, rotten heart. Caleb pushed through the swinging doors, and the wave of noise and stench hit him like a physical blow. The air was a vile cocktail of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and something meaner, something desperate. Men with hardened faces and guns on their hips lined the bar or hunched over poker tables, their laughter coarse and loud. A piano in the corner was being punished by a player who knew more about force than melody. Caleb moved through the crowd without hurry, a wraith gliding through a bonfire. He was looking for a face, listening for a voice, hunting for any sign of Pike or his men. He was about to turn and leave when the saloon's cacophony suddenly died. A side door slammed open, and a man strode out, dragging a figure behind him. Caleb didn't recognize the man. He was tall with greasy hair and cruel, wolfish eyes, but he recognized the cold arrogance. He was one of Pike's. Behind him, tethered by a coarse rope around her wrists, was a young woman. She was Apache, maybe 20 years old, her face streaked with dirt, but her spirit unmarred. Her black hair was a tangled cascade down her back, and her hands were bound, but her chin was held high. She did not cry or beg. Her eyes, dark and fierce, swept the room with a defiant fire that refused to be extinguished. The man who the crowd called Silas slammed a boot on a poker table, rattling the chips. "All right, boys, listen up," he barked, his voice grating. "Mr. Pike is feeling generous. One night with this savage beauty. Highest bid takes her home. Tame her if you can." A wave of predatory cheers erupted from the men. They were dogs being thrown a piece of raw meat. $5, someone shouted. "6. I'll give you 6 for a piece of that fire." Silas grinned, his teeth yellowed. "Come on, she's a fighter. That makes it more fun, don't it?" The Apache girl stood unflinching, her gaze a silent condemnation of every man in the room. It was a look of pure, undiluted disgust. Caleb felt something shift inside him, a rusty gear grinding into motion. He didn't know why he moved, only that he had to. The way her eyes met his across the room was not a plea for help, but a challenge. He saw in her the same defiance he felt boiling in his own gut. He pushed past a drunkard leaning against the bar, his boots scuffing on the grimy floorboards, until he reached the table. The room fell quiet again. All eyes turned to him. Silas squinted. "You got a bid, Ghost?" Slowly, deliberately, Caleb reached into his boot. He ignored the whispers, the snickers. He unfolded the single silver dollar and laid it on the table. It wasn't currency. It was a statement. The coin rang against the wood with the finality of a gavel. A man at a nearby table snorted. $1 hell that wouldn't even buy the rope around her neck. The crowd roared with laughter. Silas smirked. "You serious, friend? That's your last coin." Caleb nodded once his gaze locked not on Silas, but on the girl. He was speaking to her, a silent promise, in the oppressive room. He saw her not as an object to be bid on, but as a person trapped in a nightmare. His voice when he finally spoke was quiet, but carried the weight of a tombstone, because no one else in this room deserves to look at her again. The laughter died instantly, sputtering out into a tense, charged silence. The air grew thick. Silas scratched his scruffy chin, his wolfish eyes narrowing as he sized Caleb up. He saw the worn-out clothes, the empty holster, but he also saw the unyielding hardness in Caleb's eyes. He saw a man with nothing left to lose. "Hell," Silas finally said with a shrug, scooping the dollar off the table. "One night, $1. Fine. Take her." He tossed the end of the rope toward Caleb's feet like a leash. Caleb didn't pick it up. He held the girl's gaze, then looked down at the rope binding her wrists. In one smooth motion, he drew the worn skinning knife from his belt. The click of the blade locking into place was the only sound in the room. He stepped forward and in front of everyone sliced through the coarse fibers. The rope fell away. The girl staggered slightly, her balance returning. Her wrists were raw and bruised, but they were free. Without a word, Caleb offered her the knife hilt first. It was an offering of steel and silence, a transfer of power that no one in the saloon could comprehend. She looked from the blade to the man who had bought her, only to give her back her own defense. She took the knife, her fingers closing around the worn leather handle. Then she raised her head, her posture regal, and walked slowly to his side. Their eyes met again. He did not ask for thanks. She did not offer it. But in that shared glance, a silent pact was forged, something deeper than gratitude, more profound than freedom. It was the seed of an alliance. She spoke then, her voice clear and proud, her English accented but strong. "I belong to no man." Caleb gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then don't walk behind me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "Walk beside me." And they did. They walked out of the Dead Lantern Saloon together, turning their backs on the stunned silence of the crowd. They stepped out into the vast dark expanse of the desert night, into an unknown future. As the saloon doors swung shut behind them, a drunk near the doorway muttered, "That man's a fool." Another man, older and wiser, whispered back, "Maybe. Or maybe he's the only one in this whole damn territory who ain't." The desert did not forgive. Long after the yellow lights of Dust Creek had been swallowed by the horizon, Caleb and the Apache woman walked in a shared silence beneath a bone-white moon. The star-dusted sky stretched into an infinite cold canvas watching them. The howl of a distant coyote was a lonely lament carried on the wind. Every sound was magnified in the stillness, the crunch of their boots on the gravel, the rustle of sagebrush, the steady rhythmic beat of two weary hearts. They made camp in the shelter of a dry riverbed, beneath the gnarled, crooked limbs of a mesquite tree. Caleb built a small, efficient fire, his movements practiced and deliberate. He gave her space, a commodity more valuable than gold in this harsh land. There was no rope, no orders, no prying questions. He simply offered her half of his water from a battered canteen and the last crust of his bread, and then leaned back against his saddle, tilted his hat over his eyes, and feigned sleep. She watched him, her gaze unwavering. Her name was Nayeli, daughter of Chief 10 Crows. Her people had once ridden like the wind across these lands, their songs woven into the very fabric of the canyons and plains. But the cavalry had come at dawn, and their blue coats a harbinger of fire and death. They brought rifles that spoke louder than drums, and a hunger that consumed everything. Her father had died with a warrior's blade in his hand, and a curse on his lips for the men who had burned their world. She had been captured, bound, sold, stripped, not only of her freedom, but of her name, her dignity, her very self, until this quiet, haunted white man had spent his last dollar to buy her, only to hand her a knife. She did not trust him. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Men like him with sad eyes and gentle hands were often the most dangerous. They always wanted something. Nayeli waited. She waited until the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers and the moon had climbed to its zenith. Caleb remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and even. Rising with the silence of a hunting owl, her bare feet making no sound on the sandy earth, she crept across the small clearing. Her fingers found the cool, familiar shape of the knife he had given her. She wrapped her hand around its hilt, the leather warm against her palm. Her breath caught in her chest as she moved closer, a shadow within a shadow. He lay there vulnerable, his hat shielding his face, one hand resting on his chest. One swift, clean thrust. It would be quick. She could be gone before sunrise, truly free. She raised the blade, the polished steel glinting in the faint starlight. But as her muscles tensed, his voice cut through the night. It was calm, clear, and devoid of fear. "If you're going to do it," Caleb said without moving aim for the neck. "It's quicker." Nayeli froze, the knife held aloft, her heart hammering against her ribs. He lifted the hat from his face, his eyes meeting hers across the dying fire. There was no anger in them, no fear, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. "I am not your enemy," he said softly. "You bought me," she hissed, the words sharp as flint. "I bought you to stop them from touching you," he replied, his voice even. "It was the only thing I could do. You cut my bonds, but you still follow. I stay because the territory east of here is crawling with bounty men. Men who would kill you for $10 or do far worse for nothing at all." She gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles white. "You think I need your protection?" "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I think you need a choice. And that's different." His words hung in the air, simple but resonant. Nayeli stepped back, the knife trembling in her hand. "I do not understand you." He pushed himself up, leaning on one elbow. A deep sigh escaped him. "I don't understand myself most days," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to be hunted. And I know what it means to be free, but utterly alone." The silence that stretched between them was taut like a drawn bowstring. "I won't stop you," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Walk wherever you wish. But if you head east, they will find you, and they won't offer you a knife." Her breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. She stared at him, this man, who possessed nothing, no horse, no gold, no home, and yet had offered her the one thing she had prayed for. In the darkest nights of her captivity, freedom without chains, without claim. With a shuddering exhale, she lowered her arm. The knife fell from her grasp, landing softly in the sand. "I do not walk behind men," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. Caleb nodded, a flicker of understanding in his tired eyes. "Then walk where I can see you. That's enough." She sat down, not close, but not far either. The fire crackled a small spark of warmth in the vast cold darkness. The stars wheeled overhead indifferent. In Nayeli's heart that the storm of rage and fear still churned. But somewhere deep inside, in that sacred place where memory met the soul, a profound shift had occurred. This man had not tied her. He had not taken from her. And yet she had not run. For the first time in a long time, the choice had been hers to make. The sun was cruel by day, but the nights brought a different kind of danger. Caleb and Nayeli traveled west, following the long shadows cast by the hills moving like whispers against the vast, silent land. He spoke little, his words, as sparse as the vegetation around them, used only to point out a hidden trail that bypassed a town or a spring of clean water tucked into a rocky crevice. She asked no questions, but her curiosity grew with every mile. This strange man who never touched her, never made a claim on her, yet never left her side, was an enigma. Their destination was the foothills of the Sierra Madre, where the mountains rose like stone guardians against the endless sky. Caleb had heard whispers of an old abandoned mining town nestled in those peaks, a place now rumored to be a sanctuary for those who wished to disappear. But the path to sanctuary was treacherous. Before them lay Wolf's Gully, a narrow canyon carved between two sheer bluffs, its walls too steep to climb, offering no escape and nowhere to turn. Caleb paused at the gully's entrance, his hand instinctively brushing the worn grip of his revolver. A cold feeling settled in his gut. "Keep close," he said, his voice a low command. Nayeli nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Halfway through the gully, the wind died and the air grew thick and stagnant. Then a voice, oily and smug, echoed off the rock walls. "Well, well, look what the desert blew in." 3 men stepped out from behind the rocks, their figures materializing from the shadows. They were dust-covered, their rifles held at the ready, their grins too wide and predatory. One wore a tattered Union coat, a bitter parody of the uniform Caleb once wore. Another had a gruesome necklace of dried human ears. Bounty hunters. Vultures in human form. Caleb moved without hesitation, placing himself squarely between them and Nayeli. "You folks look lost," the tallest one sneered, his eyes lingering on Nayeli with a covetous hunger. "That there is an Apache girl. We got standing orders to bring any of 'em in. $10 a scalp. 20 if she's still breathing." "She's not for sale," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold as riverstone. The men laughed, a harsh grating sound that scraped against the canyon walls. "Ain't up to you, friend." The world exploded in motion. Caleb moved with a speed that belied his weary frame, a flash of the disciplined marshal he once was. He drew and fired in a single fluid movement. 2 shots perfectly placed. The man with the ear necklace crumpled to the ground without a sound. "Run," Caleb shouted to Nayeli, not looking back. But Nayeli didn't run, not away. She darted sideways, using the boulders for cover, as gunfire erupted, the shots echoing like angry thunder in the narrow pass. Caleb kept the remaining 2 men focused on him, drawing them deeper into the gully, buying her time. He knew he couldn't outrun them, not with the wound in his side from 2 nights ago, still tender. But maybe she could. He fired until the chamber of his revolver clicked on an empty cartridge. Then he ran, his lungs burning until his legs buckled. He collapsed behind a large rock, a fresh, searing pain blossoming in his side where a bullet had grazed him. The world tilted, the blue sky spinning above. From inside his coat, he pulled a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. Inside was a sharp knife and a hand-drawn map detailing hidden trails and water sources, routes only he knew. He placed them gently on the ground, where the trail forked, a silent offering, a final gift. He leaned back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes fixed on the sky. At least she gets to keep walking. He thought a strange sense of peace settling over him. But then he heard footsteps. Not the heavy, clumsy tread of booted men, but the light, quiet, determined fall of bare feet on sand. Naeli. She appeared from behind a rock, clutching the rifle of the bounty hunter Caleb had shot. Her hands trembled, but it was not from fear. It was from a cold, righteous fury. She raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The second bounty hunter dropped. The last one, seeing he was now alone, turned and fled, scrambling back down the gully like the coward he was. She dropped the rifle and rushed to Caleb's side. Blood was already soaking his shirt, a dark crimson stain spreading across the worn fabric, but his eyes were open, watching her. "You came back," he rasped, a note of disbelief in his voice. "I do not leave those who fight for me," she whispered, her voice fierce. A weak, pained smile touched his lips. "You were supposed to keep going." "I chose not to," she stated simply. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress and pressed it firmly against his wound. He winced, but didn't make a sound. They sat there together, surrounded by the profound stillness of death and the indifferent desert. And in that shared silence, with the scent of gun smoke still hanging in the air, the fragile threads of trust between them were forged into something stronger. She had run. He had stayed to fight. But now they would stay together. The fire crackled, a small island of light and warmth in the vast, enveloping darkness of the canyon. The stars overhead were sharp, brilliant diamonds scattered on black velvet, silent witnesses to the stories the world preferred to forget. Caleb sat with his back against a smooth boulder, his side bandaged, his face pale in the firelight, but his expression calm. Across the flickering flames, Naeli sat cross-legged, the fire reflected in her dark eyes, her long black hair catching the light like raven feathers. The silence between them was no longer empty or tense. It was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. After a long while, Caleb shifted, pulling a piece of dried meat from his pack and offering it to her. She took it with a slight nod, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "There was a boy," Caleb began, his voice low and raspy, as if pulling the words from a deep, hidden place. "Back in the war." Naeli's eyes flickered toward him, but she remained silent, listening. "Maybe 10 years old, barefoot and starving, came wandering out of the woods after a nasty skirmish down in Georgia. His name was Isaiah." Caleb paused, the memory casting a long shadow over his face. He was a freed slave, or maybe just escaped. I gave him what was left of my water, and rations hid him under my coat when the company marched through. Thought I was doing the right thing. His jaw tightened. But they found him. My captain. He said I was harboring a runaway. Said it was a violation of orders. They beat the boy right in front of me and told me to stand and watch. I couldn't. Caleb stared into the fire, his eyes seeing a past that was more real than the present. I jumped in, fought back. They broke 3 of my ribs, stripped me of my stripes, and left me in a ditch for 2 days. The boy, he ran during the chaos. I never saw him again. The silence returned heavier this time. I still think about him, Caleb confessed, his voice barely a whisper. Wonder if he made it. Wonder if someone else helped him, or if the world just swallowed him whole like it does so many. Naeli watched him for a long moment before she spoke, her voice soft but clear. The world swallows many. She leaned forward and fed a dry twig to the fire, watching it catch and flare. My father was called 10 Crows. He was a chief not of bloodline, but because he could carry the weight of our people when others could not. He taught me how to track the elk, how to read the patterns in the wind, how to listen to the whispers of our ancestors. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not weep. He died in the raid. The cavalry came before the sunrise, burning our lodges, shooting our horses. My mother died holding my little sister. I watched it all from the rocks where I was hiding. My father. He took 3 soldiers with him before they cut him down. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. I swore I would not forget. I swore I would never let their world erase ours. Our songs, our names, our fire. Caleb finally looked away from the flames and met her gaze. You carry it well. And you. She countered her eyes, searching his. You carry ghosts. He gave a slow, somber nod, more than I should. Another silence settled between them, but this one was different. It was a space filled with shared memory, shared loss, and the strange, unexpected comfort that comes when 2 broken things recognize the fractures in each other. You and I, Naeli said softly, her voice like the rustle of leaves. We are not the same people. No, Caleb agreed. But we are both still standing. A small, sad smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen. Sometimes, she said, that is all a warrior can do. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the night sky, joining the distant stars. They sat like that for hours until the embers burned low and gray. 2 survivors with different blood, different gods, and different griefs, yet bound by the same quiet ache for a world that was gone. And there in the space between their wounds, a bond of trust stronger than steel began to weave itself into being. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The harsh desert landscape gave way to rugged slopes dotted with juniper and cedar. Somewhere in the distance, the faint, rhythmic beat of a drum echoed against the canyon walls, a sound Naeli recognized in her very bones. This was not the land of her birth. That place was now only ashes and ghosts. But these ridges had once been the hunting grounds of her ancestors. And here, tucked into a hidden fold of the earth, near a creek that still ran clear, a small camp remained. Smoke rose in slender columns from hide lodges stretched over wooden frames. The sounds of life dogs barking, children laughing, drifted on the wind. But as a sentry spotted Caleb, the laughter died, replaced by a sudden tense silence. Warriors emerged from the lodges, their faces grim, their bows drawn and ready. Naeli stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. She spoke in her native tongue, her words swift and urgent. The archers hesitated, their eyes darting from her to the white man beside her. One of them turned and disappeared back into the camp. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, a man emerged from the largest lodge. He was broad-shouldered and imposing, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in 2 long braids and a necklace of turquoise and bone. His eyes were sharp as a hawk's, weary from a lifetime of loss, but unyielding. This was Tachi, war chief of the Hidden Ashes Band. He ignored Caleb completely, his gaze fixed solely on Naeli. You were thought to be dead, he said in the Apache language. I escaped, she replied. His eyes flickered to Caleb. And this man? He saved me. Tachi's jaw tightened. No white man saves without first intending to take. He finally turned his flinty gaze on Caleb, switching to a broken but clear English. Your skin carries the color of war, stranger. I have buried sons who bled from the hands of men like you. Caleb did not flinch. I have buried people too. The secondary twist from the instructions needs to be woven in here. Tachi must reveal his own personal loss at the hands of a raider who matches Pike's description. Tachi stepped closer, his presence radiating a dangerous authority. And what brings you to our fire now? I wanted her to be safe, Caleb said simply. That is all. The war chief stared at him, his eyes seeming to peer directly into Caleb's soul, weighing every truth and every lie. He then turned to Naeli. "He destroyed my first village, the one by the singing river," Tachi said, his voice dropping to a low guttural growl, his pain a raw open wound. A man leading a band of ex-soldiers. They rode under a banner with a coiled snake. They burned our homes and took our women. My wife, my son. They died in the fire. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. A coiled snake. He had seen that emblem before, crudely tattooed on the arm of one of Pike's men in Dust Creek. Pike wasn't just a slaver. He was a marauder, a warlord carving out a kingdom of fear. The stakes had just risen from a personal quest for vengeance to a war for the survival of an entire people. "You say this man is different?" Tachi said, his voice hard as stone, returning to his test. "But if he is not, the blood he spills will mix with ours. We must know his heart. You must prove his loyalty." Naeli's breath caught. "How?" "By doing what your father 10 Crows would have done to an enemy brought to our fire." Tachi commanded, his voice ringing through the silent camp. "Kill him." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Tachi unsheathed his own heavy hunting knife and handed it, hilt first, to Naeli. The entire camp watched, a silent circle of judges. Women peered from their lodges. Children stopped their games. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. "Do this," Tachi ordered, "or leave with him and never return." Naeli took the blade. Its weight was a terrible, familiar burden in her hand. She turned to face Caleb. He looked at her, his eyes calm and clear, without a trace of fear or betrayal. "If this is the end," he said softly, his voice for her alone, "then it is yours to give." She stared at him, at the man who had bought her freedom with his last dollar, who had shielded her with his own body, who had asked for nothing in return. She saw not an enemy, not a white man, but a fellow survivor, a man carrying his own ghosts. Her hand trembled. She stepped closer, the polished steel of the blade catching the afternoon sun. Then, with a defiant cry, she threw the knife to the ground at Tachi's feet. "No," she declared, her voice ringing with power. "I will not kill the man who carried me through fire when no one else would." She turned to her chief, her eyes blazing. "If that means I am no longer one of the people, then I will carry my name alone." A gasp went through the crowd. Tachi stared at the knife, then at her, his face an unreadable mask. A long, tense silence followed. Then an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, stepped forward. "The girl has the spirit of her father," the elder said, her voice raspy with age. "And the man's blood was spilled for her. That blood counts." Tachi bent down, picked up the knife, and looked from it to Caleb. "You bleed for her, once stranger," he said, his voice a low growl. "If you stay, you may bleed for us all." He sheathed the blade and turned, walking back toward his lodge. The test was over. The circle of warriors broke. Caleb and Naeli stood together, not as outsiders, but as something new, something untested. They were not yet family, but they were no longer alone. And now, they shared an enemy. The fight for the locket had become a fight for their lives. The wind shifted days later, carrying not the scent of pine, but the bitter tang of dust and gun oil. Caleb, sharpening an axe blade near the central fire pit, felt at first a prickling on his skin, a soldier's instinct honed by years of war. He stood, his eyes narrowing toward the southern ridge. The camp dogs began to bark a frantic, high-pitched chorus of alarm. Mothers swept their children into their arms, their faces tight with fear. Then came the sound, a low rumble, that grew into a thunderous pounding of hooves. It echoed through the valley like a war drum, a promise of violence. Tachi burst from his lodge, a rifle in his hand. Nayeli was already there, a bow slung over her shoulder, a quiver of arrows at her hip. "They have found me," she said, her voice grim. "No," Caleb corrected, stepping forward to stand with them. "They've come for all of us now." Over the ridge they came, a line of dark figures silhouetted against the sky. At their head rode Harlan Pike, his posture arrogant, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Behind him were more than a dozen riders, a rough collection of ex-soldiers and outlaws, their faces hidden by bandanas, their eyes cold and empty. They bore the emblem of the coiled snake on their saddles. Pike reined his horse to a halt just beyond the camp's perimeter. "Good evening, savages," he called out, his charming voice a chilling mockery. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Tachi stepped forward, his rifle held steady. "You have no claim here, Snake Rider." Pike's laughter was a dry, ugly sound. "The girl is property bought and paid for. She ran. I'm simply here to collect my investment." Caleb moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Tachi and Nayeli. "You'll have to go through us." Pike's eyes locked onto Caleb, a flash of recognition and amusement in their depths. "You, the broken marshal. I should have let you hang in redemption." His smile vanished. He raised a hand, a silent command. His men raised their rifles. The world dissolved into chaos. Before Pike's men could fire, a volley of arrows flew from the trees, silent and deadly. Two riders tumbled from their saddles, arrows protruding from their chests. Pike's men answered with a deafening barrage of gunfire. Bullets tore through hide lodges, shattered pottery, and kicked up plumes of dust. The air filled with screams, gunpowder, and the defiant war cries of the Apache warriors. Tachi barked orders, and his warriors, who had been waiting in hidden trenches and behind barricades, rose up to meet the assault. This was their home, and they would defend it with their lives. Caleb grabbed a fallen warrior's rifle and dove behind a wagon, returning fire. His movements sure and steady. He laid down covering fire for two young boys scrambling for shelter. Beside him, Nayeli moved like a phantom, her bow an extension of her arm, loosing arrow after arrow with lethal precision. And then the sandstorm hit. It descended upon them without warning, a furious, blinding wall of red dust whipped up by the freakish mountain winds. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world became a swirling vortex of grit and noise, isolating friend from foe. The battle devolved into a series of desperate close-quarters skirmishes fought between ghostly figures in the storm. Through the maelstrom, Caleb saw her, a little girl no older than 6, who had been separated from her mother. She stood frozen in the open, clutching a small doll, her eyes wide with terror. Pike dismounted and, furious, spotted her at the same time. A twisted, vengeful idea formed on his face. He lunged for the child, grabbing her and pressing the barrel of his pistol to her head. Thorn Pike bellowed, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. "Come out, Marshal." Caleb emerged from the blinding dust, his rifle held low. Nayeli was close behind, her knife drawn. They found Pike near the edge of the camp, using the child Nan as a shield. "Let her go, Pike," Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm. "I don't think so," Pike sneered, his grip tightening on the terrified girl. "It's fitting, don't you think, you and me ending things with a child between us? It has a certain symmetry." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a hatred that went far beyond a stolen girl or a lost bank robbery. "You don't even remember me, do you?" "Not really." Caleb's blood ran cold. Pike's voice held a familiar cadence he couldn't place. Redemption was just business. Pike continued, his voice dripping with venom. "But this is personal. My name isn't Pike. That's just a name I took. My name is Harlan Pikesmith. Does that ring any bells, Captain Thorne? The name hit Caleb like a physical blow, unlocking a nightmare he had kept buried for years. A farm in Georgia. The war. A skirmish. Screams. Fire. Pikesmith Farm. Pike hissed, his face contorted in a mask of grief and rage. My family were homesteaders. We wanted no part of your war. But your Union patrol came through chasing rebels. You gave the order. Burn the barn, you said. Flush them out. But the rebels weren't in the barn, were they, Thorne? My wife and my son were. They were hiding there, praying for your war to pass them by. The memory flooded back, vivid and horrifying. The smoke, the screams of a woman he couldn't see, the captain telling him to hold the line, that it was collateral damage. A tragedy of war. I lost everything that day because you were just following orders, Pike roared, his sanity finally snapping. So now you get to make a choice. Not as a soldier, but as a man. An eye for an eye, Marshal. A child for a child. He aimed his pistol not at Caleb, but at the screaming little girl in his arms. In that split second, Caleb's life came into sharp focus. The guilt over Sarah's locket, the ghost of Isaiah, the weight of Pikesmith Farm, it all culminated in this one terrible moment. This was his chance, not for revenge, but for redemption. He didn't hesitate. He didn't raise his rifle to fire at Pike. He dropped it and threw himself forward, his body, a living shield covering Nan, just as Pike pulled the trigger. The bullet slammed into his back, at the impact a white-hot explosion of pain that stole his breath. He grunted, staggered, and collapsed over the child. His last conscious thought a prayer that he had been enough. Nayeli screamed a sound of pure anguish. The sight of Caleb's sacrifice broke through Pike's haze of madness. In that moment of distraction, Tachi and his warriors burst from the swirling sand. Pike turned, but it was too late. An arrow from Nayeli's bow struck him in the throat. He gargled, his eyes wide with surprise, and fell to the ground, the great Harlan Pikesmith silenced forever. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had come. The wind died down, and the red dust settled, revealing a scene of carnage. Pike's gang was broken, its leader dead. The camp had held. Nayeli rushed to Caleb's side, turning him over gently. His shirt was soaked in blood, his breathing shallow and faint. "You fool," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "You magnificent fool." He managed a weak, pained smile. "Did I?" "Atone," he whispered. "Stay with me, Caleb," she begged, pressing her hand to the wound. "Stay with me." The little girl, Nan, crawled out from beneath him, unharmed. She looked at the bleeding man who had saved her, then wrapped her small arms around his neck and held on as if he were the only solid thing in a world turned to dust. The tribe gathered around them, their faces a mixture of grief and awe. They had witnessed it all. Not just a battle, but an act of profound sacrifice. A white man had given his life for one of their children. A man who had once been an enemy was now and forever one of their own. The pain came first, a sharp, searing fire. Then it faded to a dull, distant throb. Caleb drifted in a fevered haze, lost in a landscape of fragmented dreams. He saw fire and wind, heard the screams from a Georgia barn, and felt the cool weight of a silver locket in his hand. Voices murmured around him, soft and indistinct whispers, in a language that was not his own, but felt like a lullaby. Time became fluid, a river with no banks. He was aware of cool water on his lips, the gentle touch of hands changing his bandages, the scent of healing herbs. When he finally opened his eyes, the world was bathed in the warm, golden light of a late afternoon. He was inside a lodge looking up at a woven ceiling of deer hide and wooden beams. Nearby, someone was singing softly, a low and steady Apache melody. He turned his head a slow, painful effort. Nayeli sat on a stool beside his cot. Her hair was neatly braided, and her hands were stained with the herbs she had been using to treat him. Her bow was leaned against the wall, but the knife he had given her was still at her hip. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. She immediately held a cup of water to his lips. "Do not talk," she said, her voice softer, quieter than he had ever heard it. "You were gone for 3 days. The healer said you walked in the spirit world. We did not think you would return." He took a sip of water, the coolness a blessing on his parched throat. "How many?" He managed his voice a hoarse whisper. "How many did we lose?" "3 warriors," she said, her eyes sad but proud. "They fought with the strength of bears. We honor their journey. Many more are wounded. But we held. The camp held." She paused, a small smile touching her lips. "And you saved the girl?" "Nan. She has refused to leave the entrance of this lodge since the battle." A breath that was half laugh, half groan escaped him. Stubborn. She learned from the man who shielded her with his own spine, Nayeli replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Days bled into weeks. Caleb's wound healed slowly, a testament to the healer's skill and Nayeli's constant care. He learned to walk again, first leaning on Nayeli, then with a cane, and finally on his own. The people of the camp, once wary, now greeted him with nods of deep respect. They would offer him a portion of their food or simply sit with him in a shared comfortable silence. He was no longer the white stranger. He was the man who shielded the child. One morning, when the air was crisp and clean, Nayeli led him to a ridge overlooking the valley. The wind whispered through the pines. Below where the battle had been fought, something new was taking shape. Travelers moved along the trail, but they were no longer just Apache. Caleb saw white settlers, Mexican traders, and a family of mixed heritage all stopping at a newly built trading post. A sturdy corral held their horses, and a simple wooden structure offered shade and water. "What is this?" Caleb asked, his voice still rough but stronger now. "An idea," Nayeli said. "Chief Tachi's idea and mine. A place of peace. Not a town, not a camp. Just a place to rest, to trade, to breathe. A place where the trail is safe for everyone." "Who will run it?" She turned to him, her dark eyes searching his. She took his hand, her fingers warm and strong in his. "We will," she said softly. "You never asked me to stay, Caleb Thorne. You gave me back my choice, and I choose this. I choose you." He looked at her, truly saw her not as the defiant captive or the fierce warrior, but as the woman who had guided him back to the world of the living, who had pieced together the broken parts of his soul. He reached up and gently touched her cheek. "Then I will stay," he said, "if you'll have me." She nodded once, a gesture that held the weight of a lifetime, a promise of forever. Months later, the settlement at the ridge, which came to be known as Survivor's Rest, was thriving. It was a place born from conflict, now dedicated to peace. Laughter had replaced gunfire. Names were exchanged instead of bullets. A blacksmith with a Navajo wife set up a forge. An old prospector taught the children from both cultures how to read and write. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, Caleb walked with Nayeli to a small, newly planted cottonwood tree at the edge of the settlement. In his hand, he held a familiar object. During the cleanup after the battle, one of the warriors had found it on Pike's body. The silver locket. It was dented and scratched, the clasp broken, but it was his. He opened it and showed Nayeli the faded picture of Sarah. "This was my wife," he said, his voice quiet. "She died of fever before the war. This locket, and the guilt I carried for not being there. It's what kept me hunting pike. It's what kept me a ghost." He dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of the young tree. He held the locket for a moment longer, then placed it inside and covered it with soil. He was not burying a memory, but letting go of a ghost. Nayeli watched him, her expression full of understanding. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a small, smooth river stone. On its surface, she had painstakingly carved the image of a raven. "The raven is a messenger," she said, placing the stone in his open palm. "It flies between worlds. It does not forget the past, but it always flies toward the future." Caleb closed his hand around the stone. It was cool and solid, a new anchor for a new life. He looked from the stone to Nayeli, his heart full of a love he never thought he would feel again. He had come to the desert seeking revenge, a broken man, with nothing left to give. He had found something far greater, not just redemption, but a home, a family, and a new understanding of freedom. It wasn't about the right to wander. It was about the choice to stay. Together, they stood and watched the last rays of sun paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Their hands intertwined, their future stretching out before them, as vast and as promising as the land they now called home.